Welcome, everybody. We are quite pleased that so many of you have made it here because the weather was again dodgy last time, atrocious in fact. And last time that was a bit of a problem with presence. We had quite a few people on the Zoom. Welcome to our second Finance on Trial seminar. My name is Waltraud Schelkle. I'm a political economist here and at the SPS department. We're discussing today, did Western finance help or hinder political and economic transition in Eastern Central Europe? And I have two star witnesses here and star jurors, obviously, to match. There's first Dóra Piroska. She's an associate professor at the CEU in Vienna now. She's a real CEU person, how should I say? Has done her PhD at the CEU and has then at some point joined the faculty after a little outing with family, and that's a good thing too. To my left is, of course, Thorsten Beck, that whom you all know, an economist who is the director here of the Florence School of Banking and Finance. What qualified, and he volunteered for this topic, him with saying, "Oh yeah, I was once wrong on that topic." As a that's a kind of, I interpreted it freely, but you know, that's how I saw it. When he worked at the World Bank for actually 8 years, and had a view on this that I knew would clash a little bit with that of Dóra, so we invited the two. And then we have, of course, our jurors who will question them in pairs. There is first Miranda Loli. She is an Albanian-born, grown up in Germany, political scientist who has worked for the UN. No? Yeah. I just, sorry, I have a loose connection. Sorry, I don't want to now put this up in thing. Then there's Alexei Kiselev, who is Russian-born, but has now worked for quite a while here. He's at the Florence School of Banking and Finance, and he's an economist, has worked in a bank before in Russia. And that experience actually is quite relevant for his position. I go now through the expert witnesses. The next is Yusuf Prasic, and he is Austrian, is here a historian at the department and does an economic history degree, a PhD. And last but not least is Sasha, whom all of you may know as a book author, but he asked me to do a little, perhaps. No, and he's a Max Weber fellow, second year here, and a political scientist. Great. So I would first like to ask Miranda briefly, what's your position on this question?
Yeah, thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me to participate in this very interesting format. As you mentioned, my name is Miranda. I am an IR scholar, so I approach this topic very skeptically from my field of research on global anti-corruption and the role of international organizations. So to also mention what Waltraud mentioned before, I've been involved in projects with the UN Office Against Drugs and Crime. So my skepticism against the role of finance extends beyond just the role of foreign banks in the region, but also to include global financial players operating from outside the region. And I'm particularly interested in also the role that this foreign global capital actors play in being involved in money laundering schemes.
Thank you. Alexei.
Pleasure to meet everyone here. My name is Alexei. I'm an economist, and I approach the question with my economist background, so mostly from the efficiency point of view. I regard the developed financial sector as a prerequisite for economic growth and increase in living standards in any region, not only in Eastern Central Europe. Having said this, I believe that equality is not a secondary consideration here and is an important factor for any policy question. So in forming my opinion, I also take this into account. Thanks a lot.
So when you want to speak, where the person is basically on.
Okay, this one. That's cool. So now. Okay. I would like to start again. So I approach this topic as an historian, and my point of view is that this impact of Western finance is neither universally positive nor wholly detrimental. And as a historian, we say, the reality is much more complex. It's very difficult to say, okay, this was very bad or this was very good. And I'm particularly interested in why in some countries, this finance involvement had a better impact than in other countries. So we would have to focus on the local factors which shape the benefits and challenges of this Western involvement. Thanks.
And there we go. Okay, mine works. Yes, thank you, Valtrud, for inviting me and for the lovely introduction. So I approach this as a scholar of the political transition, right, as a political scientist in the region and in former Yugoslavia specifically. I would say I'm sort of skeptical of the role of finance in the transition, especially in the early period. But obviously, given the sort of mixed record in the last 10, 15 years, right, I'm also not convinced that it was either my fundamental question is, it may have been necessary, but was it sufficient to engender a sort of successful transition, right? And I look forward to our wonderful contributions this evening and helping me understand that question.
Thanks a lot. So just as a starter, most countries in Central and Eastern Central Europe welcomed foreign banks right after the transition. And the idea was, of course, to speed up their political and economic transition from authoritarian socialism. The banks, the foreign banks, predominantly from neighboring countries in Western Europe. So that may be my Austrian thing all the time, because Austria is obviously close to Eastern Europe, often followed foreign direct investors. And they helped them to finance strong growth and to develop foreign investment-based economies, today also called dependent market economies. Households got more choice in saving and credit instruments, notably for acquiring home ownership. However, these banks then also seem to privilege these large foreign direct investors over smaller businesses, the domestic businesses in the region, and were suspected to put pressure on governments to provide them with privileges, selective business advantages. They were involved in fueling mortgage market bubbles in foreign currency that threatened to bankrupt households when the bubble burst and the financial crisis since 2007 evolved, partly because the exchange rates immediately devalued and then that revalued their debt. Hungary and Latvia needed bailout programs more than a year before Greece. And so to investigate this very mixed record of Western finance during perhaps the consolidating years of transition, but also even earlier, and Dóra, for example, and Thorsten have done research on this, we entitled the two to be expert witnesses. The format is such that we want always two to discuss with one of or inquire with one of the witnesses for about 20 minutes. It should be a back and forth. They have prepared some questions, so not long lectures. And Then we go back and take a step back, and the jurors and I will discuss, so which arguments were new to you, which arguments did you find convincing, which perhaps less convincing, and then we open up for you in both here in the room and those in the Zoom. Okay, without further ado, Miranda, would you like to start with the questioning of Dóra?
Sorry again. So yes, thank you very much to Dóra for being here. I have had a little bit a chance to familiarize myself with your research, although this is not necessarily my area of research. So as I mentioned, I will try to come to this from a bit of an international relations perspective. So I think my first question will go a little bit into what your research has highlighted as financial nationalism. And for example, also in the case of Hungary. And I would like to ask whether, while financial nationalism has been effective in some ways economically, has it eroded democratic principles? So how do you see this kind of trade-off evolving, maybe in the case of Hungary, but also more broadly in Central and Eastern European context, between sort of economic success at some point, or economic stabilization, and the erosion of democratic principles, particularly also when it comes to the integration in global financial systems and the system of the EU? That's just a first question to start us off on a political note.
All right, thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. Thank you, Waltraud, for inviting me to this very unusual setting where I'm a witness. All right, so financial nationalism is kind of countering Western financial influence, right? That was one of the aims. And I'd like to immediately start with complicating what exactly do we mean by financial nationalism, because the term was picked up in relation to Hungary and Orban. However, in the region that we are looking at, we can actually look at, if not financial, but more broadly economic nationalism in democratic settings, and that would be Slovenia in the 1990s, but also in the early 2000s. So if we look at Slovenia and see how this country evolved in the early 1990s, we see banking sector dominated by state-owned bank. Until 2013, 80% of total banking asset was state-controlled by two major banks, Nova Ljubljanska banka and Nova Mariborska banka, were doing fantastic job in supporting finance to the rest of the Slovene economy, which was also until roughly after the global financial crisis, dominantly Slovene-owned. So domestic ownership was very important. They were going for niche markets. And I also would like to mention that this was all done in a relatively stable democratic setting, right? So I did my PhD on Slovenia. That's the secret to it, that I know so much about it. And in the 1990s, this was a major outlier in most of Eastern Europe, where privatization of banking and liberalization of finance prevailed. And the reason I was pushed for this case was that, so why? How did they do it, right? And to answer that question, I had to go back to both the Yugoslav past of Slovenia, the corporatist setting, the variety of societal actors being involved in banking supervision and finance. And particularly the setup of bank supervision came out as key in this tumultuous and turbulent 1990s, where bank supervision in Slovenia was organized as part of central banking, right? Not as a separate institution under the Ministry of Finance. So the most prestigious bank regulators, the best paid people, were supervising the state banks. And for me, and that's what I argued in my PhD, that kind of created this balance between a state-owned bank and efficiency, right? As Alexei put on the table, it's very important in banking, both stability and efficiency. And that was how it was pursued. So it was an economic nationalism, financial nationalism that actually did not undermine democracy and was absolutely not open to Western financial investment. I remember talking to Jože Menzinger, one of the key architects of Slovene economic nationalism, and he was saying, banking, it's not something we would not know how to do, right? So that was kind of the Slovene point. Now, compared to that, Hungary was a very different case, and the 1990s was primarily characterized by liberalism for a very good reason, because there was incredible corruption and wasting of resources and inefficiency in banking. So Western investors were helping the Hungarian state to cut through unhelpful and corrupt lines of businesses between state-owned banks and semi-privatized businesses. And so Western banks effectively functioned as bank supervision in Slovenia, kind of making case that efficiency is going to finally dominate banking and finance, and were very helpful in this. However, came the early 2000s when Western banks became greedy in two ways, for me at least. If I may also contribute to what Waltraud just said about their role in providing Swiss bank and euro-denominated mortgages to Hungarian would-be mortgage owners or homeowners, and so that kind of created or brought in, and as the global financial markets made it very, very clear, incredible instability to the financial sector.
I think Miranda wants to ask you a bit more about this.
Share more
about the crisis?
About the crisis?
Yeah. So
anyway, just to introduce it, so financial nationalism in Hungary has awakened against this, right? This greedy, unstable, unhelpful behavior of foreign money. It was a retaliation. And as Orbán advanced it, it was also incredibly detrimental to democracy. So
I did have also a question on sort of the crisis, but now listening to you speak, I have more of an immediate reaction. So if I understand you correctly, corruption was actually a big difference between these two countries that
yes,
actually changes the trajectory.
Absolutely.
Would you agree with that? Okay.
That's very true, especially in the 1990s, right? Later on, I don't think so, but then for sure.
Should I continue with my other question? Yeah, I had another question in terms of sort of the role of then crisis, and I was going to ask this question first about the 2008 and the crisis, but now also thinking a little bit more about it, I'm also very curious about the role of the COVID-19 crisis in the region and the role of foreign banks in that. So I recently stumbled upon an IMF working paper on COVID-19 and foreign banks, and this question in the region, particularly this question whether they're shock absorbers or whether they're transmitters of crisis, and I'm wondering on your reaction towards that. But of course, also the previous 2008 crisis. You can pick your crisis.
So one thing I would like to put down on the table that hasn't been really mentioned just yet, and I think it's very important to understand the role of foreign banks today in the region. And that is this Hardy et al. 2013 paper that very nicely described the transition from bank-based finance to market-based finance in global financial markets, right? Banks abandon their real market base and primarily securitize their liabilities and securities, right? So the business model of banking today is very different from the 1990s. And that has repercussion in Eastern Europe in very interesting ways. The Eastern European subsidies do not do that, right? In my research, I haven't seen any capital markets which would be trading securities created by this bank. However, they also are disincentivized for the very same reason that banks are going into this direction, to lend to the real economy. So banks today, primarily in Eastern Europe, finance households and to some degree SMEs, but they really has to be nudged to finance SMEs. So when we talk about their role of banking for the real economy or society at large, we have to realize that they're really decoupled. So these are FDI-dominated, multinational companies-dominated markets, right? And those MNCs self-finance or even go and securitize assets. So They don't touch or talk to local banks. And so when we think about the role of banks in these countries, actually their role for the functioning of the economy, for the growth model, is marginal. It's very small. So some people like Dóra and Cornell argues, this is why Orban could advance an incredible financial nationalism in this sector, because it wasn't so important for the economy. So this is my kind of answer to you, what to expect from the banks in the times of crisis. Way less than in previous epochs.
Last question. My last question then goes in a totally different direction and sort of ties back to my introduction at the very beginning, because as I mentioned, I'm interested not in the role only of foreign banks on the ground, but also in the role of foreign banks that are situated in global financial capitals or European financial capitals, and the role that they play in enhancing money laundering schemes from the region. So if we look at the corruption perception index, of course, the region is getting better in some ways, but not necessarily that great. If we, however, look at the financial secrecy index, it is countries like Switzerland and other Western European countries that are doing much worse in terms of financial secrecy. And yet again, if we also look at the anti-money laundering index, it's also a very mixed record for the countries of the region. So I'm curious to hear from you, but then maybe also later from our second speaker. What do you think is the role of foreign banks in money laundering schemes?
So thank you. This is a very interesting question. At the moment, I know very little about it. I'm going to share that little with you, but I'm also working very interestingly on a paper on this right now with one of your former PhD student, Edgar Zekmanis, on Latvia and Estonia. We're going to look at money laundering in Latvia and crypto in Estonia, primarily as they bring in foreign actors to this. And the argument I think we're going to put forward, it's in the making, is how this happening on the periphery of EU financial regulation and the lack of enforcement, effective enforcement, basically, in the case of money laundering of existing regulations, to the extent that it's the US which has to step in to do something about a money laundering regime in Latvia. Edgar, I think, argues that Latvia basically put up a growth model on money laundering in a sense of they were using foreign banks, particularly Scandinavian banks, to invest in their economy for a lot of reasons. And then it was okay for Latvian regulators that the major profit or business model of these banks was to channel Russian oligarchs' money through their accounts and wash them clean. But this is happening in the periphery, right? Within Europe, within the banking union. And so how is it possible, right? So this makes a lot of questions about lack of alternatives for these countries to pursue this. And also, the attention of European regulators on the periphery and how important is that for them, and the lack of thinking about the spread of these practices from the periphery. If you acquire it there, it's gonna enter Scandinavia pretty quickly, and there's very little thinking about that. So it's my
Yeah. Thanks a lot. So I wanted to shift discussion a little bit toward economic gain and losses from the foreign ownership of the banking sector. So in the introduction to this debate, Walter has basically explained how the foreign ownership was looked at when it started and what are perceived benefits of it. But then there was only one major drawback and one case that was mentioned about house price boom and bust cycle and mortgage initiation linked to Swiss franc. And I just spotted that exactly the same thing happened in some other countries, including Russia, where state-owned banks and local private banks were issuing mortgage loans in US dollars or in euros. So they were doing the same thing, and ownership did not really matter for this kind of, one could say, irresponsible behavior when they exploited low financial literacy of the households. So what's really a control group here? Who do we compare these foreign banks to? What is a viable alternative, and was there any?
Thank you. No, I agree with you, right? The Hungarian banks were also domestically controlled and very much involved in providing Swiss franc and euro denominated mortgages without considering the risks built in the exchange rate differentials. However, Rachel Epstein, in her research on Poland and Hungary, shows that once the crisis unfolds, it's the Polish publicly owned bank and the Hungarian domestically controlled bank, which becomes partner of the government to manage the crisis in a way that foreign banks do not partner up with the government in terms of providing credit also at the same time when there is a crisis, and so the banks are obviously crisis prone and would not want to. So there is a kind of a substantial political distance between foreign owned banks and domestically controlled banks, even in these countries where the majority of the banking sector is foreign controlled, when managing a crisis. So maybe in good times, they are the same irresponsible, but in bad times, at least in her research, she found that domestically controlled banks are more willing to pay the bills and be partner of the government for managing a crisis. So that I find quite an important difference. And also, there was an alternative. So my whole Slovene case study is about that it could have been done in a very different way, given that bank supervision kept in very good institutional position.
Yeah, I really like your answer, because this is exactly efficiency, stability trade-off that you highlight with the presence of foreign banks. But one thing that I found interesting is that you brought into my second question really naturally, because this anticipation of partnership between local, quite often state-owned banks, and the state during the crisis is pretty much a prerequisite for what famous Hungarian economist János Kárnai would call soft budget constraint. So one could argue that anticipating this kind of partnership, sometimes coming in the form of bailouts, local banks and state-owned banks could actually take more risks than they would do otherwise, what foreign banks would do, for example. And then in anticipation of this, they would have a risk overhang, and the crisis itself would be more pronounced, more likely ex ante to begin with. So what would János Kárnai say about presence of foreign banks? And like maybe he would say that they help to alleviate the sort of budget constraint concern, right, and make the whole system efficient and stable in this way. So I'm wondering, what's your opinion on this?
Thank you. Very nice. I worked with Kárnai a little bit in his last years. And we discussed, of course, and I wrote also about the soft budget constraints. So this is indeed something that has been brought up by liberal economists oftentimes to argue for hardening that constraint. You need an ownership change, right? And that exactly, as I said, played out very nicely in the Hungarian case in '95, when the government sold a bank for just one forint to a foreign owner, because whatever it takes, right? Take it, we can't control. It's a source of corruption. Please take it. We really must establish a hard budget constraint, and changing ownership would help us. But as I argued in my Slovene case study, it's just one option, right? Again, just repeating myself, institutionalizing supervision in an effective way can also serve even in the case of state ownership or domestic ownership, as hard constraint. I mean, just look at Germany or Austria or a lot of West European countries where banking nationalism dominates. Germany just doesn't want to let go domestic controlled banks to Italy, right? It's a current case right now. And nobody talks about the lack of, hard budget constraint or soft budget constraint. So in this sense, I think in some countries, changing ownership helped. So one can argue for this case, but I wouldn't universalize it as the one and only solution.
Thank you very much for your detailed answer.
Let me just say, none of these questions were answers and questions were scripted. The jurors, so in case, I mean, I was really quite impressed how you responded to all these quite wide-ranging questions. So Dora had not seen these questions before, nor had Thorsten, who is now in the hot seat. Yusuf, why don't you start? But
yeah. Mr. Beck, thank you very much to be here. It's quite a pleasure to ask the first question. Before this event, I had not known your research, so it was quite a pleasure to read some articles, even though it's not my field of expertise. So I would like to start with a very general question. As I told in the beginning, I take the stance of a historian, and my question would be, what role did historical legacies, such as prior economic structures or political cultures, play in mediating the effects of Western financial involvement in Eastern Europe?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. I mean, yes, there is. So actually, before I come to this, can I just make some general comments? Number one, I want to briefly define what Western finance means, in my view. I'm not saying that this is everybody's view, because it can be a very kind of broad concept. So by Western finance, I mean really, and we have 80% we have talked about this, cross-border banks, so banks from mostly Western Europe, extending into Central Eastern Europe. By the way, not immediately. That's actually not quite true what you said, Waltraud. It took actually almost a decade before they really went into forcefully, because there was a bit of a process before, which I'm probably going to come back to in just a moment. So on the legacy, yes. I mean, there are lots of legacies. I mean, actually, I wrote a paper once on these legacies, not related to financial development, but more to, in general, to what we economists like to call institutions. Institutions, rule of law, control of corruption, political stability, and so on. And I focused on two. One is the so-called natural resource curse, meaning countries that rely more on natural resources do not really, don't have the same need to develop institutions that underpin manufacturing, service, and so on, because they can focus on just digging out stuff. And that affects countries, and I actually look back at the paper at some point, countries like Russia, Ukraine, Romania as well. So it doesn't go, it's not really east-west, it's also north-south partly. The other one is there is the legacy of how long have you been under the communist regime. And of course, there it's the 15-3, so 12 former Soviet Union, the 3 Baltics, a bit less, and then the rest of Central Eastern Europe. And that can explain to a large extent actually how these institutions have developed. Now, how can I bring this back to finance? Partly also because what we have learned as kind of economists, financial economists studying these things, is that the financial sector doesn't operate by itself. It has to rely on what we call, again, institutions, a proper court system, a collateral registry, property registry, functioning courts, laws, regulation, and so on. And all of this has actually also developed quite a lot over the past, well, now 35 years of the transition. And lots of this divergence actually happened during the first 10 to 15 years. Actually, again, when you think about people studying this on longer term, they're actually not surprised. They wouldn't be surprised to see that Russia went the wrong way. although actually one famous economist who's probably also on the shortlist for a Nobel Prize once wrote that Russia is an almost normal country. That was Andrei Schleifer. But I don't think it's a normal country anymore. But anyway, so I think there is a lot to be said about, yes, legacy influencing how these countries have developed, also how these countries ultimately have macroeconomically developed, how they have democratically developed and so on. So there are, again, huge differences. Of course, another item, another factor which I won't go into is religion. Muslim versus Orthodox versus Catholic. That is also an issue that some people have pointed to. Now, the other issue I want to briefly refer to as an introduction maybe, also where foreign banks went into. So it was the Austrian Italian banks that were kind of the first ones to really reach out very early on. I mean, Austria, obviously, because they used to be part of that Austrian Hungarian Empire, which also comprised quite some other countries. I'm not going to embarrass myself by trying to list them. And Italy also, because I mean there was some connection there as well. So I think this also has helped partly. Which, by the way, this is one last point I want to make before going to the next question. Is when we talk about foreign bank entry, this part of the world, Central Eastern Europe, is very different from other parts of the world, because again the foreign banks are not as foreign. Meaning what we call distance, geographic distance, but also cultural distance, historic distance, is not the same between, let's say, Slovenia and Austria, or even Croatia, or even Albania and Austria or Italy, especially not Albania, Italy, because many people in Albania speak Italian, as I found out. Then, for example, between London and Kampala, London, Nairobi, London, even Joburg, or Madrid, Rio de Janeiro. Yes, there's some cultural, but some historic, but not as big, or let's call it New York and Mexico City. So that there is a difference here between the foreign bank entry in this part of the world and other parts of the world.
Yeah, thank you very much. You mentioned a key term I would like to ask further, institutions. In my own research, I'm also dealing with institutions, the development of institutions in the context of family business. So it's absolutely a different topic, but still, I mean, institutions, when you think about Douglas North, for example, etc., who need plenty of time to develop. And we are talking here about a very short time, you know, and I was just wondering, I mean, this Western finance, did it really help to develop these institutions? I mean, as you said, we need a proper court system, we need property rights, etc. Is it possible to introduce them from outside, or do they have to develop somehow naturally inside a particular country?
Actually, that I wouldn't blame. I wouldn't claim that Western finance caused the institution buildup. I think that's been somewhat parallel. But actually, to take again a step back, I mean, why were these countries? And again, one is also always to be careful when talking about 27 countries or so, because there were lots of different developments. So, but one phenomenon that I could see, and actually, so this paper, I think, also Waltraud distributed it. I wrote 14 years ago. I distributed it without having read it again. So, and I read it now on the train back from Rome. So, and I'm still okay with most of what I wrote. So that's pretty good. After 14 years, pretty good. Almost 15 years.
Yes, okay. You were right all along.
No, I'm not saying I was all right. No. Because this ends in 2009. The date is from 2010. So no, exactly. So there is lots of things have happened. For example, the withdrawal of the foreign banks, the Vienna Initiative, all of this came after I wrote this paper. So there are lots of things actually I agree they went wrong, the boom bust, which is typical after liberalization and so on. But the initial stage, I think I still agree with what I wrote during this first 30 years. So the foreign banks were partly brought in because the experience with private banks in many countries when deadly wrong, which again was driven by this Wild West idea. This kind of almost like Chicago economics, like, oh, let's just let the banks bloom, let 1,000 flowers, let 1,000 banks bloom, of which, of course, the 990 went under shortly afterwards. I think Russia was one of these countries where they actually, which then turned into zombie banks that had to be resolved at some point or shut down. Other banks then, I mean, Slovenia might be an outlier, but in other countries, having still the state-owned banks sitting there, lending to state-owned companies, that it did exactly not resolve what Alexei referred to earlier as a soft budget constraint. So they kept just lending to the old guys, the state-owned companies, which were pretty much broke in most cases, not all cases, but in most cases. They couldn't finance a new private sector. And that's exactly where ultimately the foreign banks came in. And I agree with Dora that nowadays most banks, foreign, government, private, whatever, do mortgage lending in this region. Well, it's the same in this part of the world. It's the same. I mean, Germany is an outlier maybe, but for the rest of Western Europe, it's mortgage lending. So that's what most. I mean, if you go up to Denmark, Sweden, yeah, yes. I mean, that's a different discussion. Maybe we can invite you back to discuss that. So basically, Western, and then ultimately, the other thing then. The banks had to be, the banks, of course, made losses on these loans to the state-owned companies. Ultimately, they had to be bailed out. How do you bail out banks if you don't have money? Very easy, you print it. You print money. Well, not literally, but which ultimately caused inflation. And then several countries, I think Bulgaria was one of them, I think Hungary as well, they basically said, well, we have to put a stop at it. And they actually learned an experience from Brazil and Argentina, which is basically said, well, we have to stop bailing out banks. How can we stop bailing out banks? Well, again, we sell them off. Private ownership hasn't really taken off either, so they ultimately went to foreign banks to take them over, which also helped, and there is evidence on that they ultimately did help kind of cut this link with state-owned companies, and did help also to a certain extent the growth of the private sector. Now, did Western finance help build institutions? No, not really, I would say. I wouldn't make that argument. I think, again, there was a lot of, I mean, coming back to legacy, again, if you think about the former Hungarian Austrian Empire, I mean, there was still something there. So some of these countries went back to basically their old legal tradition, as we like to call them, be it German or some of them Napoleonic. The one experiment which went completely wrong was Russia, where they actually tried to implement, I guess, common law, which of course went completely wrong. I mean, they had to give up after a couple of years because it just didn't make sense to have an American-style legal system in a country like Russia. But I think partly, again, what I mentioned in my answer to your first question, so there was a historic kind of legacy tradition that could be kind of relied upon to rebuild these institutions. And that's why also countries, sometimes we look at distance, kind of being closer to Western Europe, kind of being closer to having candidate status for the EU. And I would claim, again, the historic legacy also helps in kind of building up these institutions. Now, I didn't say no to your question, because I think there can be kind of a virtuous cycle in the sense that foreign banks can help also then further reinforce this kind of building up the institutions through basically saying, well, you want us to lend more to SMEs? Give me a credit registry or give me a collateral registry. So there can be kind of a political lobbying basically to kind of build the institutions that they need to function better, which again, in a country where you can make money, let's say many countries in the Central Eastern Europe certainly make sense. Again, I have done lots of work in Sub-Saharan Africa. The foreign banks, many foreign banks don't have any interest in doing this because they can make the money other ways. So, but again, there was this kind of, so it's, again, to answer your question, it's not really the case, I would argue, but there can be an element to it where foreign banks can help. They can also be bad, of course, but it can help actually build these institutions.
Thank you very much for the answer.
Sure. Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity to come and ask you some questions, right? Yeah, so following on the institution question, I guess. So I have also researched Slovenia, right? So I am partial to the, well, it's nice if the countries all get along and they do the regulation internally and they can maintain the stable transition. But Slovenia also fell apart, right, at some point, right? The model did not prove perfect in the long run, right? So what do you think are the most important long-term impacts, right, of the role of Western finance in the region, right? Are there any models? Did anyone, most countries are also now deleveraging or reducing the role of Western finance and the rise of financial nationalism. What, like 30 years on, right, what do we see as the sort of long-term tail?
Well, I mean, I think you have to make a big difference here between different parts of Central Eastern Europe. I mean, let's start with the Euro area. I mean, Slovenia, Slovak Republic. I mean, these are they are supposedly part of the banking union, right? So we can't really now theoretically we shouldn't have any banking nationalism, as I think you referred or somebody referred to earlier. I mean, we have this. Well, not a standoff yet between Germany and Italy on UniCredit Commerzbank. But so that should, there shouldn't be any foreign banks anymore, ultimately, at least not from the viewpoint of Europe being European banks, right? It shouldn't. And maybe we get there eventually. If UniCredit goes through, maybe. I actually, not from the business viewpoint, but from economic viewpoint, I'm actually kind of in favor of that. That would actually be a big step towards that. Outside Euro area in the EU, let's say Czech Republic, yes, it's I guess there's a mix here. I mean, again, they are much closer, of course, than outside the EU. And there, what is the legacy? Yeah, I mean, so one has to look at two things. One is the cyclical part, and one is the structural part. The cyclical part, we've gone through once at least, maybe on the second round already. No, I mean, we've gone through the kind of the what we call deepening, a deep financial deepening, which then turned into a boom. Partly because of the Swiss franc, Euro, also partly Euro mortgages, which turned out to be, which were actually done, also just to note that, because there is this economic theorem, Balassa-Samuelson, that countries that develop, and these countries were developing very fast, their currency appreciates. So actually from that viewpoint, it made sense to actually take out loans in Swiss franc. Of course, nobody counted on the global financial crisis coming in between. And ultimately, but there were warning signs actually. And it's interesting, I remember a discussion that I had with a friend in 2007 on the streets of Washington, DC, where we kind of wondered, well, after now almost 10 years without a crisis anywhere in the world, any serious crisis, what's the next region to have a crisis? Central Eastern Europe was the response, which turned out to only be half true because it was first the US and Western Europe and then the Central Eastern European countries. But anyway, so that's on. So we had the boom, and then of course the bust. We had the regulatory interventions, the Vienna Initiative, and so on. But I think also by now there is much more consciousness in terms of the role of foreign banks in these countries. There are limitations. There are responsibilities, which, and of course, there's also much more now consciousness in terms of that boom bust cycles. Maybe you can't avoid them completely, but to at least kind of mitigate them, not to let them get out of hand. I mean, that's the whole kind of macroprudential agenda that's being done. On a structural level, I mean, again, I would argue that there. And again, I'm I don't want to say causal, they're not a cause, but they were part of the transformation process. And they did have a kind of a positive role in that, in the sense that they helped build up the private sector. Ultimately, yes, they also went into household lending, which per se is, again, is not bad. Mortgages are not bad, right? I mean, many of us had or have mortgages. Of course, it gets out of hand if it turns to a credit boom, right? And housing boom, which then can turn the wrong way, right? So I think, again, overall, there is a positive role. But again, any foreign bank entry, the role of foreign banks in general has to be very carefully regulated and supervised, like any banks, domestic or also government-owned banks. And I think there's a strong case to be made, at least unless you're a country like Estonia or Latvia, that you want to have some kind of a mixed system, domestic banks, foreign banks, or foreign banks maybe from different countries. So that's, yeah. If I can, just one quick point that I want to just kind of repost to the issue on foreign banks and anti-money laundering. I remember ABLV. It's a Latvian bank. That was actually a rather famous case. That was before Danske Bank, and that's a Latvian bank. And they were heavily involved. So actually, I think, by the way, across the large banks, I mean, HSBC, I think that's a prime case. Really, really bad. But money laundering is a chain. There are lots of players involved. starting from the small up to the big global banks. So they're all, there's nobody really getting away in a good sense, I have to say.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. Sorry, I just had a question we go on to money laundering. So yeah, just to then flip this on its head as well, right? I was wondering what role do you think the Western finance played in sort of preparing these countries to become more active players within the European Union as well, right? And sort of further integrating them politically into the European Union system by, were these links helpful in building bridges, right? To make them, more Europeanized, right? In terms of financial systems, or do you think maybe that these sort of bust crises created resentment, right? Of European influence?
On the second one, I'm not sure. On the resentment, it might be, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised. There should have been some resentment after the Swiss franc mortgages went the wrong way. So the interest rate on these went the wrong way. So I wouldn't be surprised. Yes, I think they did help. Well, again, as I mentioned earlier, I think they helped build the private sector. They helped in the convergence process, I guess also in banking practices. I mean, yes, I guess UniCredit Slovenia, I guess it exists, it's not the same as UniCredit Italy. I hope they have better customer service. I mean, there are certain banking practices that being a part of a cross-border bank and that are being taken into these countries. So I definitely think it helped integrate these countries into the EU. Was that the decisive thing? I mean, I think when it comes especially to the financial sector, while politically integrating, yeah, I'm not sure, but this is really a decisive factor. I'm not quite sure. I mean, ultimately, when it comes to the integration, especially in the financial sector, of course, the regulatory initiatives after 2008, and banking union is only one of them, no? The EBA, the whole BRD and so on. This, the fact that small country has to be part of a supervisory college, even if it's a very small, as long as it's part of the EU, and all of this, that helps, but these are regulatory initiatives. Although there's still an unlevel playing field, I would argue. But so I think that in this context, but I think it's not necessarily the banks themselves, but it's more the regulatory response to these banks.
I want to chip in. So honestly, I think the question should be asked the other way around. Like, what Eastern Europe cross-border banking teaches the European Union single market about the benefits of cross-border banking, especially in times of crisis? So it's like...
And what is your answer?
Mixed. But I mean, in a way, Eastern Europe is way ahead in terms of cross-border banking than what the banking union and other regulatory structures in the EU would like to create in terms of efficiency, for achieving higher efficiency. And so, yeah, so the banking union is about creating a leveled financial market in Europe, in which finally we would see cross-border banking and larger efficiencies and larger volumes across Europe. And that's what we don't see. But if you look at Eastern Europe, we actually do see cross-border banking. And this is what the EU would like to achieve so that was my point.
You're kind of saying it's actually the other way around. So
exactly.
No, I agree.
The EU should be learning from us.
Yeah. No, but again, this is, I mean, this takes us a bit away from the current question. But so my view on this is that there's an underlying reason both why we don't see cross-border banking in Western Europe, and we don't see the completion of the banking union, and that's banking nationalism. And I mean, again, the German position on UniCredit is the best example for that. And I guess the Central Eastern European countries and traditional economies didn't have the luxury of allowing themselves banking nationalisms in the 90s and 2000s. Because again, they had to do something with their banking sector. As I mentioned earlier, they need this disciplining tool, and that's why they turned to the foreign banks. I mean, of course, in Hungary now, they kind of turned it around, right? Orban kind of went back to banking nationalism, and of course, the wrong way, but that's, yeah.
Let me at this point ask you, jurors, was there something that surprised you or didn't quite convince you very much in these answers that you've got? Alexei, you look at me, so I'll take you first.
Right. No, I found all the answers and questions very interesting, and it made me think about something, and in particular how local private banks are different, because experience of Russia is very particular, of course, but I think many other countries are like this, that business standards in local private banks are on average quite low. So once some average level is surpassed, actually the trade-off that foreign banks introduce into the local banking sector is quite different, right? So that made me think about the way forward after the transition. The trade-offs are different now, so maybe we could learn something from the past, but going forward, different paradigms should be used. So I thought that's very interesting idea. And Thorsten's commentary about Italian and Austrian banks involved in Russia shed light on why UniCredit Bank in Russia has registry number 1, because it was the first foreign bank registered ever, except for the local savings bank. So I learned something today for sure. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you very much to this incredibly sort of spontaneous answers. And yeah, I'm definitely a fan of this format from now on. So I think I also learned a lot. I think the answers that were given to in regard to Slovenia were very interesting to me, because I didn't know a lot in depth about this case. And I think that was very interesting to see that sort of alternative models are in a way possible, but yet, of course, as Sasha also was mentioning before, there are limitations to that. And if everything goes well, then yeah, sure, you might have a better outcome. We might be careful with that, but I think it's still very important to look at this kind of alternative trajectories and alternative examples. One thing, though, that I was a little bit puzzled about was the answer Thorsten was giving to the question on institutions that Yusuf posed, and specifically when we were talking about courts. It's very interesting to me that we always say, well, the rule of law is very important for foreign banks, and a functioning court system is very important for foreign banks, or in general for the healthy financial system. Yet, in the case of disputes, to my knowledge, foreign companies as well as foreign banks will circumvent national courts and will go to the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes. And I don't really know cases where sort of when there was a dispute locally, it was the local courts that were asked then to adjudicate over that. They are constantly being circumvented or not.
Well, I think you're talking about big cases. You're talking about loans to big companies, maybe project finance. I was more referring to the standard loans to small enterprises, to households. And I think there you cannot go to international court. It's the local, especially if they're subsidiary. So I think that's point still holds, I would say. Of course, again, for the cross-border, which is also not typically direct lending. So it's basically Citibank in New York lending directly to somewhere in Albania, for example. That, of course, that would not go to the local courts, also because they would, from the very beginning, the contract would say, no, you have to go to the New York court.
Sure, but then that brings you to the question of sort of how much do then these institutions matter in this debate that we're having, or are they just circumvented very often?
Sure. As my two colleagues have already said, I mean, we learned a lot today, I think, everyone here, and it was quite a pleasure to be part of it. And I do not really have something to say about issues, topics I disagree. Maybe I can say something which really convinced me when we had this talk about institutions, and Professor Beck talked about historical legacies, and I was quite happy to hear that, because, you know, in a nutshell, history matters. So, I mean, to think about it, that after the fall of the Iron Curtain, that Hungary, for example, could go back to a tradition of Austria-Hungary, where Russia, for example, absolutely fails to introduce a common law system because they have no roots into this kind of system. So, I mean, wonderful to see that still history matters. Yeah.
It's nice to feel vindicated in your approach and worldview, right? Yeah, no, yes, I yes, once again, generally liked all the comments, right? So I'm personally always of the opinion, right, that another world, right, is possible, and so I really like the Slovenian case. I placed a lot of faith in that, but I found it really interesting that the story here seems to be one of convergence, right, for better or worse, right? The grand experiment of the 90s has come to an end, right? The crises of the aughts sort of, put an end to that. And now everyone is sort of converging on this very average position, which might not be great, right? I mean, ideally, we wouldn't all be going to banking and financial nationalism, but it seems to be the case of sort of slow deleveraging in the East, right, to match the resistance in the West. And I guess in some ways that's a success story as well, right? If we're talking about, building a truly European continent, if that's the common denominator we can all agree on, I guess, is that hopeful? I don't know. That doesn't feel hopeful to me. But it's interesting. Yeah, like I said, the long tail of it was the part that really intrigues me most. So thank you.
Let's open to your questions, comments, whatever. Briefly introduce yourself and don't forget that you need the mic. That also applies to those in the Zoom. Please just raise your hand. Okay, Kenneth Amaeshi, you will be in the queue. Please, the lady here.
First of all, I would like to congratulate for the choice of the topic. Because 30 years, sorry, I'm Milica Uvalic. I'm a visiting fellow at the Robert Schuman Center, but I have been a professor in economics for a long time at the Italian University, and I have also taught a course on transition in Central and Southeastern Europe. So these are topics that I've been following all my life. And somehow, especially the literature on the effects of banking sector privatizations has actually been very scarce altogether. And so I'm glad to discover Dora's work, which I would gladly read. I'll try to be short. I think that banking sector privatizations were really inevitable. They were inevitable because at that time in the 1990s, there was no money to restructure the banking system. Slovenia was the only country that actually was able to postpone the privatization of its banking system, but we see that there was no money. The banking system before 1989, they were extremely inefficient and with many specific features, which of course most people in this room cannot even remember, but who knows what the centrally planned economy was. We remember how money was really passive as an instrument. So it was inevitable. For various specific reasons. But then no one could have believed and expected that with a global financial economic crisis, all countries would really face tremendous difficulties with the deleveraging and so on. And the same story that happened in Central and Eastern Europe is repeating itself in the Western Balkan countries, which are much less developed, and I could tell you a lot about that, but I do want to comment primarily on some of the things that have been said. First of all, about Dora's comments comparing Hungary and Slovenia. Of course, you rightly stressed this lack of supervision and much better system of supervision in Slovenia, but also, well, the initial conditions, they were very different. So basically, when the global crisis exploded, Hungary was actually, yes, external debt. Hungary at that time was one of the most indebted countries, and it was the first country to actually have to turn to the IMF for help. Slovenia did not have a high debt. I mean, there are various issues that you mentioned, but in any case, they're important. Just I don't want to talk too long, but regarding the influence on institutions, I think that the privatizations of the banks and the entry of foreign banks did very much change the banks. You know, as such, they may not have had deeper impact on economic development, on helping the local firms, and so on and so on. That's definitely the case, but they did bring good banking practices, better services for the clients, and so on. So in this sense, if we consider banking institutions, this certainly had an important impact. One last point, it regards regulation. I think that one of the main problems that still remains also in many countries in the Western Balkans, for example, is this unclear regulation, who is actually responsible for these foreign banks. Because if you look at, I'm not a lawyer, I'm an economist, but if you look at some of the EU regulations on these foreign affiliates in other countries, it should be the central banks of those countries, Italian central bank, who should be supervising these affiliates in other countries. But then it's on the countries, very frequently the central banks of these countries that have a very important role to play in supervising these foreign affiliates. So I think that many problems also today derive from this unclear legislation, but that should be researched by a PhD student to discover more. Thank you.
Thank you. I let Dora respond to this because it is a bit more contrarian to, I think, what she thinks.
I try to be brief, but it's difficult. I know. I just like to say two things about Slovenia. So one thing is about this different conditions, external debt. I mean, I feel like, 20 years ago, defending my PhD thesis again, I had a whole chapter on how they both were indebted, in a sense that, Slovenia inherited the Yugoslav debt, all of it. It was jointly, Ljubljanska Banka was jointly and individually liable. It was a gigantic negotiation to get rid of it. Okay, I really don't want to go into this because I can, and that's a problem. So, but we can discuss it afterwards. And then the other thing that came up with the end of the Slovenian exceptionalism, it seems, or I think it so far was alleged that it had to do with market forces. Now, I have a whole paper on it, how it wasn't really market forces, but particularly the EU's particular post-GFC regulatory structure, state aid, right, that immediately required privatization. At a time when there was nobody wanting to buy banks, so the Slovenes today consider themselves robbed of their banks because they had to sell them to Apollo hedge fund investment that didn't bring in no know-how, no network, nothing, just waited a couple of years and sold it further to OTP Hungarian Bank, right? So the end of the Slovene exceptionalism story, it's not a market story. It's a political regulatory story. And I think that's very important to realize about this. And then I have a few more things, if I may, very quickly, about, again, just a general comment about the role of institutions. We discussed this a few times already, and I think Thorsten was very supportive of how foreign banks need good functioning institutions, right? Rule of law, court system, stuff like that. I think what hasn't been mentioned is the kind of institutions. So what kind of laws are, I'm always surprised, rule of law, but which law? What kind of law? What kind of competition law, right? Whose interest is this law upholding? Who is it protecting, right? And it's foreign corporations, foreign competition. What democratic oversight these countries have over these laws that are, necessary for the functioning of foreign investments? I think, yes, institutions flourished and became more effective, efficient, but we also have to look at what kind of institutions are these and what kind of, how do we explain Orban's success when Orban is saying no to them, right? And there's an incredible legitimacy of Orban going against these fantastic legal entities that uphold the interest of foreign banks. And it could have been different, right? It could have been other kind of legal settlement that would have allowed different kind of societal interests to be channeled into bank regulation, right? So in a way, I also think we should think about the rule of law, about the kind of law. And yeah, I think I stop here. Thank you so much.
Very quickly on the cross-border, the foreign banks, who's responsible for them. I think the discussion is, and so the law is, I think it's actually pretty clear that also the international standards, if it's a subsidiary, it's a local supervisor, could be the central bank. I think it's mostly a central bank in Western Balkans who's responsible. The problem is, since these are subsidiaries of larger groups, there's always the issue, what role of the local supervisor vis-a-vis the national supervisor. And I kind of alluded to this earlier. In the EU, I mean, so there's what typically we use in this context is so-called supervisory colleges, but that's the home country supervisor, which used to be Banca d'Italia, for example, is now the SSM in Frankfurt, and they would call the local supervisors that are interesting for them. Now, would Banca d'Italia call the supervisor of Montenegro or the SSM? No, because yes, UniCredit, which I think is in Montenegro, is very important for Montenegro. The Montenegrin subsidiary is that much, 0.5% of the balance sheet of UniCredit. So Banca d'Italia, SSM doesn't care less, couldn't care less. Within the EU, this has been, so they might not invite the Montenegrin supervisor. We have the same problem, by the way, in Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, within the EU, this has been resolved because the SSM, in this case, has to call the not the Montenegrin, but the, let's say, the Croatian or the whatever, the non-EU country, the Czech Republic, to the table. Outside the EU, they don't have to. And that's exactly where this comes. So that there's a clear asymmetry which undermines ultimately the legitimacy of also the national supervisor, but then also of these banks, I would say.
Kenneth, why don't you unmute yourself and show your face?
I show my face, but I'm in Tunisia, so I don't know how strong the internet connection is here, but so that's me there. Thorsten, very interesting conversation so far, and thank you for leading this, and also thanks to the other contributors for their comments. I was puzzled by your reference to Sub-Saharan Africa in terms of, I think you said, you framed it in terms of the Sub-Saharan Africa being attractive, or the incentives to go to Sub-Saharan Africa. And I was thinking of it in relation to the banks and the relationship with Eastern Europe. So my question then is, did the banks work with Eastern Europe because the institutions were there, or that the banks helped to create the institutions that enable them to work in Eastern Europe? And if it is the latter, what is the rationale behind it, and why have they not done the same for Sub-Saharan Africa?
Thanks, Kenneth. So I think actually your question goes a little bit back to what I think it was Sasha who asked this question about. No, it was maybe Yusuf. No, I think it was Yusuf actually. Did the foreign banks help build this institution, or did the institution help attract the foreign banks? And I think in Central Eastern Europe it was a little bit of both. It was primarily really the foreign banks didn't really enter while there was already an institutional framework in place. It was still being built, partly with the EBRD, the World Bank, and so on, and all kind of players. But there was, of course, a certain expectation that this institution building would proceed, and that gave them an incentive to enter into these countries. And then again, I would also again argue that ultimately there was a kind of a virtuous cycle taking off with also the foreign banks again and helping to improve the institutions. Now in Sub-Saharan Africa, I think it's a very different case because also these the banks. I'm not talking about the regional banks now. I'm talking about the European, US banks. So the really foreign banks, so to say, are from a different continent. And I mean, they re-entered the continent. I think mostly in the 90s, maybe 2000s. And many of them were not really interested in any retail banking in the first place. They were interested in expat, large enterprises, maybe government business. I mean, as you know, buying and selling government bonds in Africa is a very profitable business for banks. And I think there, the institutions, I'm not quite sure they have really helped build the institutions. I somewhat doubt it actually that this has happened. And of course, I mean, again, there's of course, again, we're talking about 54 countries here. So there's a large variety, of course. I mean, we talk about Namibia, Botswana, South Africa on the one hand, or Mauritius, and then you talk about countries for Angola, Madagascar, Mozambique, or the Francophone zone, for example. I mean, there are huge differences, of course, between these countries. But I think there you can't really see the link between foreign banks and institutions, I would argue, in these countries, at least not as much. And I think that's also why foreign banks so far, at least the non-African foreign banks, have had a really limited role in helping deepen financial systems in these countries. Now, having said this, as you also know, of course, there's a kind of, well, it's not a new trend anymore because it has been around for now almost 20 years, are these so-called regional banks, right? The South African banks going north, Nigerian banks going, east, Moroccan banks going south, and then also Kenyan banks now reaching out. And I think that's a very different approach because they are much closer to the action. They often have been successful in their own country, and they can take the techniques, the banking techniques from their own country and reach out and then also apply them in other countries. Not always successful, but in many cases they have been successful. I think if at all, then it would be these regional banks that can help actually also deepen institutions. Now, has this happened? I haven't looked at it, but I think at least there, I would say, is more hope than relying on European or American foreign banks.
So just a final comment before I leave it. So what about, because you also talked about nationalism, banking nationalism, and if you also look at the proximity of Eastern Europe to Western Europe, beyond the economics, do you also see identity and other social constructs playing a role in that? So maybe there's kind of cultural affinity or identity or other things beyond just economic rationality.
Yes, it could help. So actually now I can give you a very specific example. So I've talked about in a kind of rather negative way about European banks in Africa. There's actually one which is called Rabo Development. I think it's called a Rabo Partnership now, which is part of the Rabo Group, this Dutch bank, this Dutch bank, cooperative bank. And they have gone into several countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, you will not find a Rabobank anywhere in Sub-Saharan Africa. Why? Because they always keep below 50%, and they basically maintain the local franchise. And the best example is actually Zanaco in Zambia, which they acquired, 48%, I think, some 20 years ago or so, after the government-owned bank went bankrupt. But they maintained the Zanaco brand because they knew how important the Zanaco brand, including they had a football team, for example, a soccer team, was for the local population. And they basically kind of used that to really kind of show their local roots. So there is something to that too, I would argue. I'm not sure whether this was your question, but I think that is important, yes. And I think it can also help, of course, with these regional banks going across borders.
Thank you. Thanks.
I would like to use the opportunity to say that we will have an event with Kenneth Amaeshi on Afro-capitalism, whether finance is a friend or foe of Afro-capitalism. As you know, he's a professor of sustainable finance and governance at this School of Transnational Governments. And so we will invite a major critic to the notion of Afro-capitalism that he has named to me, and I had already seen that this is the major critic. So it will be an interesting session. Tobias.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's been a very interesting discussion. Tobias Pfor, I'm a research fellow here. My question is basically, it's so far most of the comments have been restricted to private finance, right? So Thorsten, you even were very explicit about this. And basically my question is, why? So was public finance irrelevant? Because I've always been sort of told the story that the EIB and KfW, they were very important in the early days of the transition, and they actually also made a lot of money on it. And so I was just wondering, how important was public assistance, whether, from the national development banks, the international institutions, and did they help or hinder more than private finance? Thanks.
Thank you. This is a very good question. Yeah, public finance. So public finance came in a number of formats. So one thing, for example, is Bayerische Landesbank buying up a Hungarian state-owned bank, MKB. And then it was considered private by Hungarian regulators, actually quite strangely, but it wasn't. It was never really private, right? It was a public bank. So we've seen Bayerische Landesbank and other Landesbanks actually buying up quite a few banks in the region. So that's one range. They mainly behaved very similarly to private banks, by the way, but not always. Bayerische Landesbank supported Orban quite heavily when Orban came to power, and then the role of development banks. I think EBRD has to be mentioned very, as a key actor here, in a sense that EBRD was a market building bank, had a mission, or still has two mandates. One is to build markets, and the other is to build these markets in countries committed to democratic transition. And so that's what the EBRD did in banking, in particular, through equity investment into state-owned banks, which then they argued would ensure private investors the low risk that these banks, EBRD, putting its own money into it, but instead. And so with the very interesting effect today, I'm not sure it's well known, but most of the foreign banks operating in region actually has a share of EBRD on its account, like 10%, 15%, not too high. And so when we mentioned a few times the Vienna Initiative, it's of course not surprising that it's the EBRD which is brokering that Vienna Initiative, because they knew, they were sitting on the board of these banks, and they knew that, that would be nice to communicate to the rest of the world that they're not gonna cut and run, they're gonna stay. And this is why so in that sense, EBRD. So what is the EBRD then doing? I think that's very interesting. It's also building all these institutions that we talked so much, and the EBRD is building incredible liberal institutions, primarily contracting Western advisors, and writing up competition or banking laws, and demanding parliaments to ratify those laws as quickly as possible, preferably in the form of a decree, right? So in my research, I tend to conclude EBRD is incredibly detrimental to democracy in this region through the kind of institutions that it has been supporting and setting up. Maybe it was helping economic transition. I wouldn't question that so strongly, but for democracy, EBRD certainly did everything it was in its purview to weaken it. So that's the role of EBRD in my understanding. Thank you.
Thank you. Although I think isn't EBRD the one that has actually democracy in the only development bank of them all? Yeah, that's a bit sad. Yeah. So I thank actually Tobias for bringing this up, because we shouldn't have forgotten this, the role of the EBRD. Now, just to also mention, EBRD is not the typical multinational bank. It's not like the World Bank. It's more like the IFC. So they actually invest in private banks, private firms, and so on. And I think there, I agree, they had a very important role. They kind of constitute what we sometimes refer to as patient capital, in the sense patient investors, a little bit like Rabobank I mentioned earlier in Sub-Saharan Africa. So I think from that viewpoint, that has been positive. And they also had, again, this, because they had invested in these banks, they also had a critical role in the so-called Vienna Initiative. The Vienna Initiative, and it kind of brings us back to the earlier part of this evening. So again, after the global financial crisis, lots of Western European banks got into trouble at home. Their home government said, yeah, sure, I'll bail you out, but you better make sure that there's enough lending in our home country, Italy, France, Germany, Austria. And the subsidiaries in the East, yeah, well, whatever, don't worry too much about them. Which of course the host countries in Central Eastern Europe didn't quite like, but they couldn't really do much about it. So that's where the EBRD came in with support, I think a little bit of the World Bank, a little bit of the EIB. And it was basically, there was not really that much money involved. It was more like banging heads together and basically getting commitments from some of these banks to keep at least certain lending standards or lending growth goals in these countries. And at least there's one paper, well, it was written by somebody who works at the EBRD, I have to admit, shows that this has been supposedly very successful, reasonably successful. I wouldn't say very, but reasonably successful. But this was, and that's again, this was the role of the EBRD, both as a kind of minority shareholder, but even also as a policy institution. And I think this combination in this specific context, it doesn't always have to be, in this specific context, I think has been positive.
Disagree. So Cordoban has a very nice paper on this, how with the help of EBRD, basically private banks privatized a public forum that would have helped these countries with their IMF support. The one thing hasn't been so far mentioned is that only those countries participated in the Vienna Initiative, which also had an ongoing IMF program because they had public debt issue in addition to the banking issue. So the role of the EBRD was, I would correct or offer a different view, not so much to help calm financial market by incentivizing these private banks to keep lending in Eastern Europe, but to the contrary, these banks wanted to lend, wanted to keep lending. Their press was horrible because of all the things that you mentioned. And the EBRD and the Vienna Initiative is a signaling device to international markets that they're gonna stay. So I would change this in a sense. It is successful in that respect, so I would agree. And it's also only in these few countries which had IMF. So what was happening to me in a way is that the IMF, the governments, and the EBRD sitting at the table invite the private banks to it and redesign the agenda of helping these countries out of their multiple crises, debt, financial, currency, with the agenda of the private banks, right? So there was a distortion of a public forum, and private interest was channeled in it with the help of the EBRD.
Sorry to disagree, but I mean, yes, if you think that private banks only influence the political process if they are invited, I don't think so. I mean, at least this was in the public. They could have also done it behind the scenes, and there would have been worse. So that's why I'm saying I would a bit disagree, but let's.
If nobody else has a question, then I would ask one for you, to Thorsten, and one to you, Dora. So, Thorsten, you were at the World Bank, I think, during that time.
Until 2008. So.
Until 2008. And you started in 2000 or something, right?
No, 97.
97, oh God. Okay, good.
Yeah, no,
So you exactly,
yes.
yeah, we'll share that. So in this time, was the idea of privatization that economists always seem to think is bringing, you know, the know-how, the how to do it, good practices and so on. Was at the same time, Dora had already indicated that during that time to privatize, you lose a lot of money because it's so uncertain that, you know, basically you want to pay €1 to get the whole lot, and then you let it grow and revalue. Was this a way of getting the governments out of the picture and say, this banking system, we kind of let the foreign sector take it over so that we don't have all this nepotism, all these things that we suspected Eastern European governments with their old banks to have. So was it basically a political rationale, contrary to what I heard from you? Dora, to you, I have this question. I mean, sometimes one has a feeling they always portray themselves, many Eastern European countries, and perhaps the perception of the citizens is, oh, there they came, took over, and ever since then we have to cope with this these rapacious capitalists. But one thing that doesn't quite fit that image is actually Greece got in its, you know, when capital flight and so much and all that started, they get little help with that. It stayed in the euro area, so who cares? Only when capital flowed out of the euro area came Draghi with his famous speech. While the Vienna Initiative was to keep the banks, the foreign banks in Eastern Europe, leaning on them, not to go out so that we don't have a kind of currency crisis across the board. So in a way, one could also say that peripheral, and because it was small, comparatively speaking. I mean, it is not as if Eastern European finance or finance in Eastern Europe has not got ever any help that was actually beneficial to stabilize these economies through the foreign banks, where at the time it was quite uncertain what would happen because you had these mortgage bubbles and so on. Whoever wants to start.
I can start since I got the first question, and maybe. Now let me first say that I wasn't directly part of teams that were looking at privatization in Central Eastern Europe. I did some work in Russia in the early 2000s. I remember that, but it was about Sberbank back then. I remember that. Well, the IMF wanted to privatize Sberbank, and the World Bank says, yeah, maybe not. That's you don't make it better by privatizing it. So there was already kind of a shift in thinking. But I think the argument that you made, I think I tried to make earlier, but maybe I didn't make it forcefully enough. So yes, there was some macroeconomic rationale, but there was also this kind of more nepotism, corruption, kind of cutting the link between public state-owned enterprises that had to go under anyway, and the state-owned banks. This kind of argument. And again, I didn't use the word nepotism, but it kind of goes in that direction. So kind of get a bit an outsider view in there, and that kind of goes more arm's length and doesn't just rely on entrenched relationships. And I think that was certainly a part of that. More generally, I mean, I still remember very well in the early 2000s. I mean, there was a time definitely in the 90s when it was a given that private ownership is almost always better than public ownership. I mean, I remember that, of course, the UK with its all of its privatization, which I think the two of us were suffering from at the end with our water bills, right? That was kind of seen as the big poster child. And I think that trend really went away in the 2000s, when it became clear that privatization is not always the answer to the question, or sometimes the question hadn't even been asked. So why would you actually then privatize? So, and there was this, I mean, actually, I remember I wrote a paper on Nigeria, actually, and then on Brazil, I think. And there was very mixed evidence that privatization is always the right answer. In Brazil, actually, it was the right answer with the provincial level banks. In Nigeria, only to a certain extent. So it's kind of the mixed. I mean, I think what the kind of conclusion came out, it can be the right answer under certain circumstances if the conditions are right, and so on. But it's not the panacea that it kind of was made out beforehand in the 90s.
I'm going to be more generous and allow for various cases within the framework of Vienna Initiative, in which, indeed, in some countries, like in Romania or maybe in Ukraine, indeed, the foreign bank's commitment had with stability. However, I still would like to keep my previous point also on the table, that Rachel Epstein's research shows us that this bank had already an incredible commitment to these markets, and they just had they needed a signaling device for that. So they wouldn't have cut and run from Hungary, for example. And in that case, I think the Vienna Initiative served a different purpose, but yes, indeed, in Romania, probably they were already cutting and packing, and so in that case. But there is one thing I also would like to say about the Vienna Initiative, and I think it's again very typical for the kind of arrangements EBRD arranges in the region. It is about stability, right? As you said, Waltraud, it brought in stability to the region. There's one thing which was not discussed in Vienna Initiative, right? Is that how much these banks, prior to the crisis, have been profiting on this very instability that is being built up through the Swiss and Eurobond mortgages. It has never been mentioned, never been discussed or put forward as a program, how to help those mortgage takers with the contribution of these banks that have been profiting on it after the crisis, when they've been facing horrendous, very high interest rates to pay back. Redistributive questions, very typically to an EBRD arrangement, have not been put on that table, right? And this is what I mean by the privatization of a public forum, which is not helpful in this setting. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. To present myself, my name is Damien. I'm a visiting researcher at the SPS, and I just wanted to thank you all for a wonderful discussion. It's been very interesting. I have one kind of clarification question, I guess. At one point, returning to the importance of legacies, if I'm not mistaken, there were a few that were mentioned. So this the curse of resources and how long the country has been under communism. And then I think that you briefly mentioned religion, if I'm not mistaken. So the first two I can kind of understand intuitively, but the third one, perhaps not so much. So I was wondering if you could develop this. So I was wondering, does this mean that in the case of former Yugoslav countries or the West Balkan countries in general, that Catholic majority countries turn to an Austro-Hungarian model in terms of banking, infrastructure, investments, which has been maybe more successful, and then an Orthodox majority country would turn to Russia, right? And that maybe a Muslim majority would turn to Turkey and so on. Maybe because they look up to a sort of big brother, right? Or is it the other way around, where the big brother is investing for clear geopolitical motives, right? And if so, first of all, which one of those? And if, regardless of which one it is, more so, probably a bit of both, I imagine. How important is this today, right? So I'm thinking in the case of Serbia, who's very happy to accept funding from China, from the Middle East, from anybody really who's willing to give it. And yeah, if you could develop some ideas on this strand. Thank you.
Thanks. So just very briefly on the religion. So the study actually I was referring to is a study that looks within countries. So I mean, the old borders between the Ottoman Empire and the Austrian-Hungarian Empire and then the Serbian. So it goes kind of through partly today existing countries. And what the study looked at is basically how much do people trust in financial institutions? How much do they use financial services? And there's a general observation that yes, in counties and areas which used to belong to Ottoman Empire, they use much less and they have fewer trust in finance than on the other side. And I think it's mostly Catholic. Yes, so it's the Hungarian Empire, then it's the Austrian Empire, it's Catholic, yes. So I think that's, now, does it also influence it on the country level? Probably yes, as you mentioned the case of Serbia. So I think there is still also this legacy, as you mentioned. I mean, again, Croatia, Serbia, I guess that's the best example. Croatia now clearly in the Euro, in the EU and so on, in Serbia, really kind of really at the kind of border of the European project, I would argue. If I may just come back to one thing that Dora mentioned, actually I want to reinforce that on the profits of foreign banks and what happened with them. And I think that experience from the crisis actually partly informed the regulatory response during the COVID. And somebody, I think it was Miranda who asked about the COVID-19 crisis. And actually, I kind of was in the middle of it, so that's why I remember this very well. So in the COVID, in the second quarter of 2020, so by the way, the COVID, it was basically public money that was put in. Right? It wasn't the banks themselves that really, the banks themselves didn't really help. It was public money, it was public guarantees, support payment to household firms and so on. That basically kept the economy alive. I mean, the banks, of course, yes, they did a little bit because their capital ratios, their regulatory ratios were a little bit lowered. So there was a bit of an additional kind of push there, but without the guarantees, they wouldn't have lent basically. And now there was then so given that the banks were really benefiting from the support payment, not even directly, but of course, if you pay the households, if you pay the firms, the households, the firms, they can repay their loans. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been able to repay their loans and the banks would have gotten into trouble. So there was an indirect heavy support for the banking sector. And as one of the reasons, this was one of the reasons why European authorities basically called for a so-called dividend restriction or payout restriction, as we also call it, meaning that the banks should not pay out any profits until the end of the pandemic. It was lifted at the end of 21. Now, in the context and in the spirit of the single market, the idea was both from the SSM or the ESRB, where I actually work on this during this moment, to do it on a single market level. Now, several countries, and I actually talked to at least one governor in these countries, said, no, we're going to do this on a national level. Why? Because we are afraid, again, burned from the 2008, 9, 10 crisis, that the subsidiaries of UniCredit, Société Générale, and so on, Raiffeisen, take quasi our support money and then just invest it in their home country. So we're going to impose dividend restriction on the subsidiary level, which led to a kind of, it was behind the scenes, but it did lead to a certain clash between the authorities, because it was against the spirit of the single market. Then, of course, as always in Europe, there was a nice compromise being formulated. But so this kind of reflects actually the kind of the historic legacy, I guess, after what, 15 years later, not 15, no, 10 years later, that there was still this kind of like burnt child attitude to being afraid that they would be thrown under the wheel, basically under the bus.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the interesting discussions. I'm Fabio Bulfone from Leiden University and currently visiting fellow here at the Robert Schuman Center. I just wanted to ask you a question and really that goes back to banking nationalism, which you mentioned, and you know, the last episode, if you want, in the trajectory of these countries. Now we treat them as a group, but in particular in Hungary and in Poland is the return of banking nationalism with the renationalization of some banks and some service companies. Now, of course, one view of this is the cronyism of the Orban regime and, you know, banks that are now used to give credit to the clientele of the regime. However, in the Polish case, there's also the view by Marek Nadzik that this is a process actually that started in the private sector and started exactly in the managers of banks like UniCredit and its Polish subsidiary Pekao that understood that actually during the crisis there was an instance of, in a way, value extraction, because actually I did my own work on UniCredit, and during the crisis the whole profit of the UniCredit group was done in Poland. The rest was at zero, which made it a decently managed bank by Eurozone standard, but still all the money the whole group was making was in Poland. And so there was this understanding that until banking nationalism is actually defeated at the core, which is not happening as we are seeing again with UniCredit, there is need to escape the middle income trap on which these countries are falling now. There is the need to take control of some instances like banking and maybe some other services. So I wonder, what is your view about this take on banking nationalism and whether it could be positive for the development of these countries until banking nationalism is not given up at the core?
Yeah, I find it a very difficult question because so banking nationalism as a term has been developed to describe democracies as they, navigate in a global financial system with each other and create regulatory settings that prefers domestic ownership in banking than foreign ownership. And the two examples that you mentioned, Poland and Hungary, when they, step on this trajectory of banking nationalism, they also, step away from the trajectory of democracy. And the way in which they built up their regulatory setup over domestic financial institutions is also, as you say, a reaction to the coarse banking nationalism. But I think it's not only that. It's also a means through which to strengthen the authoritarian leader and support and provide support for its, economic policy and clientelism also, definitely. So in a way, you're right, it is a reaction, but it's not only that. It also has domestic political roots.
Maybe I don't know the specific case, so I'm probably Dóra is probably 120% right. Just there could be also an alternative explanation, not in this specific case, but maybe in other cases, and I can give you one in a moment, is that number one, of course, with foreign bank entry, you also build skill base, because foreign banks, yes, they do bring in skills. And eventually, if there is a market gap, which the foreign banks leave open, then why, if I'm a local manager of, let's say, UniCredit, why don't I go out and build my own bank? That Could very well. I'm not saying this is the case in the case of Poland, but one could argue that there's nothing bad about moving away to reducing the share of foreign banks heavily, because then the domestic banking sector ultimately develops. So I'm probably painting a little bit of a rosy picture here. I mean, one example I can give, again, from a different region, Mexico, after the '94 crisis, basically they had to sell off the banking sector because they were all broke. I mean, because of the previous privatization, which went completely wrong. This was one of the cases where privatization was really a bad idea. At least the way they did it, because they funded the privatization with loans from the same banks. So you basically get money from the bank and then buy the bank. I mean, you can already see there's something wrong with this idea. They sold them to foreign banks, and then the foreign bank share was like 80%. The foreign banks actually receded heavily from rural areas and poorer areas, and ultimately that's when a domestic bank came in. Which used to be a kind of what I call a white goods store, and then they kind of built a bank around that, what's called bankrupt, and that was very, very successful. So you can also have these cases, and again, that's a very different picture than probably about Poland or Hungary. So I'm not sure, there might have been politics involved or not, but it definitely was a positive story where domestic banks basically come in to fill a market gap that clearly has been left by the foreign banks.
It almost allows us to end on a happy ending, which is, not expected in this topic. But I would like to look at the jurors and ask whether they have still something they would have liked to ask. Otherwise, we can also call it. We always book 2 hours, but it doesn't mean that we have to go for 2 hours. You're right. Go ahead.
I don't know if it will help to a happy ending, but okay, I'm Juraj Pala. I'm also a researcher here at SPS, so we doing political economy, and I work a bit on the business relations in the FDI-led growth models. So I think it was very interesting to hear, to listen to this debate and hear diversity of views, and also this format. I really liked this debate. It's really unusual, but helpful to have a bit of a different setting. So what I understood, and I think I know it from my own experience in Czechia and Slovakia, the cases I know a lot. It used to be like it is in the 1990s that governments used the banks to be able to subsidize their domestically owned businesses and channel somehow the money to maintain the strong domestic ownership. And this didn't work because there were too much pressures from the internationally, domestically, that financially just didn't work. So they had to restructure these companies and sell it to foreigners and also to banks. And so from what I understood, and kind of now I can see it also as a pattern, that there is like no more money provided to the producers, let's say, domestically, but the money was channeled more to the consumers, let's say, through the loans and in this way. And I'm, this case, just wondering, kind of 2 questions. First one is like how this privatization, in your view, of banks to foreign investors is linked to the to the maintenance of the FDI dependency in these countries in the past, kind of, and also today. And the second one is kind of what options do governments could potentially have to encourage even foreign Western banks to invest more in the domestic businesses, companies, without needing to use such radical turn as in Hungary with the, let's say, really nationalization. So what maybe other tools creatively they could use to encourage them to invest, let's say, in small SMEs and domestically in these countries.
Yes, last word. Very good. Okay. So again, I don't think, again, the trend towards mortgage lending is not unique to Central Eastern Europe. We observe the same in Western Europe. So that's not really, I mean, the development, of course, was much quicker in Central Eastern Europe. I mean, in Western Europe, it has come over 50, 60 years since this, well, starting in the 80s, I guess. In Central Eastern Europe, it only started like in the 2000s. But so that's not unique to this region. How is foreign bank entry linked to the dependence on foreign investment or FDI more general? Yes, I mean, the one striking thing, and also the difference, for example, between Latin America, which was hit much less, although they also in some countries have a lot of foreign banks, and Central Eastern Europe with lots of foreign banks, is that the foreign banks in Central Eastern Europe depended much more on parent bank funding or market funding. than the banks in Latin America, the foreign banks in Latin America, which really relied on local deposits. So yes, the credit boom, I mean, again, there is, we can look at it, it depends on whether you look at it from which side of the global financial crisis. If you look at it from 2005-06, the capital inflows were a great thing because these countries were developing, they were exceeding or about to exceed to the European Union. There was investment needed and so on. So this looked all good. Of course, on the other side of 2008 of the global financial crisis, it looks very different. Basically, these capital inflows basically fueled a credit boom and ultimately led to a bust. And the foreign banks were a big part of that. So it's kind of which way you look at it. I think nowadays they depend much less on that, as far as I know. I haven't seen the most recent data, but I think there has been deleveraging also in terms of dependence on parent bank funding, which I think is also partly enforced by the regulators. So that's certainly there. But again, FDI per se, it's not a bad thing, right? It's more about, again, how is this money actually being used? So capital inflows are not bad, it's how this money is being used. How to encourage more business lending? Again, I don't think the foreign banks are necessarily different from the domestic banks. So it might be regulatory incentives, it might be tax incentives, there could be macroprudential policies to prevent asset price bubbles to develop. Again, these are more things that I would see them that apply to any country in Europe or in a upper middle to higher income country, but are not necessarily unique to the Central Eastern European region. But maybe Dora will contradict me.
I'm writing a paper about this. The context within which we look at it is the capital markets union primarily, but also a little bit the banking union, in a sense that these two post-GFC initiatives were aiming to create more stability, cross-border funding, and primarily most funding for local enterprises, right? And what we have argued in a previous paper with Rachel Epson is that it did not deliver that in Eastern Europe. Primarily, the capital markets union is incredibly misplaced as a funding increasing endeavor or legal solution when you look at the size of capital markets in Eastern Europe, right? Or the size of SMEs in Eastern Europe, right? It's way smaller than SMEs in Western Europe. So my favorite joke is that my hairdresser is not going to issue an equity on the capital market to buy the next, business next to her when she wants to grow. She's going to go to a bank. These are bank-based, markets, and they're going to. So in a new paper, what we do is that we establish this. There's no funding coming into Eastern Europe because of the banking union or capital markets union. We only look at this. And then we introduce a new concept called financial strategy. So financial strategy is what we claim a government may do, precisely your question, what regulatory and other incentives to increase funding to these local economies. And I'm totally agreeing with Thorsten, but we see across the region is that governments don't differentiate very much between foreign and domestic banks. They primarily introduce the same preferential credit schemes for SMEs or use the central bank. But then, of course, there are other new tools that these countries look at or use. Development banks, they have been dormant in the 1990s. Now they are awakening, and that's a new tool. Domestic banks, publicly owned banks, and taxation also with redistributive purposes. So what's very interesting we find in this research is that capital markets union and especially banking union wanted to create kind of a single market with roughly similar conditions, right? Rachel is American, so she titled our paper a plurius plures, right? Instead of from plurality, we wanted to arrive to something, as a singularity, but we arrived to more diversity. Precisely because the kind of institutional regulatory setting that was established was not reflective of the reality of East European financial markets. So they do what they can, right? And that's very different in each country, depending on the circumstances.
Thank you all for asking very good questions in the second half, the jurors for very concise and insightful questions, and the two key witnesses that were star witnesses as far as I'm concerned. Thank you all very much. See you next year for the